Paul's letters. Doesn't sound like a very exciting topic. But I think it's amazing what's going on here. So let's start with why in the world spend time about Paul? Okay, well, here are some reasons why. We're back to the criticism that's going on about Christianity. It's hot and heavy these days. There's a group called the New Atheists who are putting out all sorts of things, saying, we don't believe this, we're going to challenge this. Let me take you to one. Do you recognize that name up there, Da Vinci Code? Sure, okay. It's, as far as I know, it's one of the top 10 best-selling books of all time. It's just sold millions and millions and millions of copies. And at the beginning of it, Dan Brown, who's the author, says on a little blurb before you turn the first page, he says, the manuscripts, the art, the history, basically everything's true that's in here. So you get the feeling all he's done is just make up characters. Kind of like if you did World War I, let's say. You might have a Kaiser, because they had a Kaiser then. You might have Churchill as Admiral of the British Navy, or whatever he was. Admiralty, I think. So you might have that real setting, but then you might create a soldier to be in the war. Okay, they do things like that. So a lot of people thought that's what's going on with Da Vinci Code. That everything was okay and true except just the characters. Well, about halfway through the book, they have this character who claims to be this expert on ancient Christianity. And one point he says something like this. He's talking about the church history. He says, at the gathering that he's talking about, which is the Council of Nicaea, remember the time period here, 300 years after Jesus. Okay, so keep that in mind. He says it was at this gathering the many aspects of Christianity were debated and voted upon. And of course, the divinity of Jesus. Until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet. Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on at the Council of Nicaea.
It should be some of his followers, not all. Because there was, the Arians and the different groups.
Yeah.
Yes. But there were people who believed he was divine. Yes, there were people that believed he was a man.
But do you see what Brown is already doing? He's lumping it all as one. He's saying not a single person thought he was God. He was just a nice guy.
No.
And later on, the church said, hey, we need somebody better than just a nice guy to be our, figurehead. Let's turn him into God. Let's vote on it. Huh? How many think he's God? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's it.
Well, this is reflected in the wording of the Nicene Creed. We recite it every Sunday in the Episcopal Church. That's why I know there is great emphasis on Jesus being begotten, begotten, not made. In other words, the Son of God, of one being with the Father. And those words are in it too. And the point was not so much whether he was divine or not. The point was whether he was made by God or whether he was the actual physical Son of God.
Sure. Which is a different issue, isn't it, than what we're talking about here. But you see what Dan, by the way, if you ever have a chance and you read Da Vinci Code, anybody read it?
Oh,
yeah. It's a fun read, isn't it? I mean, it's just mystery and cryptography going on like crazy, and it's a chase, and it's all that stuff's great. But the problem is, he got his art wrong, he got his history wrong, and he got his Christianity wrong. But and he claimed other than that, he was just spot on. But what made that hard is that he told us at the beginning, all the rest of it is true. I'm just making up the characters. Oh no! But unfortunately, a lot of people looked at this and they said, "Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that about Jesus. Oh, I didn't know that about Mary Magdalene. Oh, I didn't know that about the early Christian faith." So apparently, the Council of Nicaea turned Jesus into something that he wasn't at all. I guess it didn't matter that the guy that spouted this stuff turns out to be the bad guy. Right, this is Lee Teaming, if you remember the story. Okay, so at least he tried to balance it a little bit. By the way, Dan Brown's stuff was not original with him. He got it from an earlier book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And so they tried to sue him because he stole a lot of their stuff, but that's a long story. He's got book after book of mysteries and things that are hidden. Right, he's always got the Catholic Church as the bad guys, and they're hiding all these documents and things like that. He loves this sort of paranoia that goes on. He's had other ones like that. Angels and Demons was another of his. Good fun reads, but boy, just don't trust the history that he so-called presents there. Then there's a group called the Jesus Seminar. I don't know if you've heard about them. By the way, I see you're taking notes here. It's okay if you want to, but I'll be glad to send you all my complete notes when we're done. So if you can just kind of sit back and relax. So. But take them if you like, if that makes you focus a little bit better or something. But the Jesus Seminar was a group of scholars, and I use the term a little loosely because they really hadn't published very much. They weren't considered very highly among true biblical scholars, but they got all sorts of press. In other words, Newsweek magazine or Time magazine or whatever would go to this group when it was around Easter or around Christmas and say, so what do you know now about Jesus? And these people would pontificate about what they had discovered about Jesus. And they did have PhDs, and a lot of them had fancy titles. Not a lot of them were PhDs actually in biblical studies, unfortunately, but they passed themselves off as these wonderful scholars, and they were great press, right? People like to have something a little different. They didn't want to hear one more story about Jesus' divinity. So, for example, the co-founder, John Dominic Crossan, you can look him up if you want, he denied the deity of Jesus. He declared that Jesus' pedigree, in other words, his birth and everything, it was just all a bunch of myths. And he said the story of Jesus' death and the burial and the resurrection were, and here's the key part, latter-day wishful thinking of the early church. So to hear it again, years and years went by, and the church said, gosh, we need somebody a little classier than just a carpenter who got himself caught by the Romans and put to death. Let's turn him into something. Wishful thinking. Wouldn't it have been neat if? And so then they created these stories about the death and the burial and the resurrection. So there's another avenue of attack. Let me show you one more. Bart Ehrman, right now, is probably the leading biblical scholar as far as getting press. In other words, every book he puts out now sells really well. Anybody see those great courses, booklets that come out to your house? Okay, any of those. So if you haven't seen those, they're selling either DVDs or CDs that are done by professors giving like lectures, on different topics. So if you flip to the religion section on great courses, or you go online to their site, guess who teaches most of the things about Christianity? Bart Ehrman. And I cringe, and I'll tell you why in just a second. I kind of cringe when I see that. At Palomar a while back, I was in the teacher workroom, and this lady was there, and she said, oh, what are you running off? I said, I'm getting something ready for my Bible as literature class. And she said, oh, I love the Bible. I think it's fascinating. I said, oh, really? I said, do you ever read anything about it? She said, yeah, I'm in a book right now by Bart Ehrman. I said, oh, because Bart Ehrman is like off the scale when it comes to being liberal, if you know what I mean by liberal. He's pretty skeptical about anything in the Bible, really skeptical. And here's what he had to say. He has a book, How Jesus Became God. Can you catch it from the title? How Jesus Became God. In other words, he didn't start out God. It was a process that the church went through. Right? So here's what he has to say. The burial and discovery of an empty tomb were tales. Right? Tales. Kind of like Pecos Bill or Paul Bunyan. Right? They were tales that later Christians invented to persuade others that the resurrection happened. So here we go again, right? Here's somebody else who's saying, oh, no, this is far later, right? People look back and created stories. Didn't happen, just wishful thinking again. So we've heard it from Bart Ehrman, we've heard it from a group of scholars, we've heard it from Dan Brown in the area of fiction. So all these people are making these attacks on, you really can't believe anything, you can't really know what happened to Jesus when he was here on this earth. Well, what's been the traditional response? People always want to take you to 4 books in here, right? Mm-hmm. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why those 4? They're the stories of Jesus, right? So if you haven't read those before, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the 4 stories of Jesus. And they tell of his death, they tell of his burial, they tell of his resurrection. So that's been the traditional response. Hey, Dan Brown, you must not have read the Gospels. Mm-hmm. Hey, Bart Ehrman, it's right here in the Gospels. Hey, Jesus Seminar, what's the matter? You guys overlook the Gospels. Well, here's the only problem with the Gospels. I mean, we'll talk, was it February? We'll talk about reliability of the Gospels. But look at the dates on here. And I'm going by what the critics say, okay? So I don't buy these dates. I think you can argue that they're much earlier, and I'll do that in February if you want to come back then. And by the way, they're out of order. Why?
Because Mark was written first.
Most people, scholars who study this, think Mark was first, and then it was the other gospel writers. So again, one more time, I'm going by what the critics say. Okay, so I'm trying to be fair to the people that are attacking Christianity. So they say, well, Mark was probably written around 70, question mark. Nobody's exactly sure. Mark doesn't start off June 3rd, 5, whatever. So let's give them that, right? 70 AD, 80 AD, 90, and clear up to 95, almost the year 100 for John. By the way, just an aside, years back, people said, attacks again, oh, you can't trust John. John was written not until like 150, 175. It wasn't even John that knew Jesus. This is a make-up, right? This is just a fictional book. So what did they find? They found manuscripts, pieces, that they have dated back to 125. Now those are copies, right? So it means John was a lot earlier, and it wasn't even found in the Holy Land. It was found way off someplace, which means it took time to get there. So there went that scholarship. Somebody said, oh, it's 150, 175. Well, how could a copy be earlier than the original, right? So the original has to be even earlier than the copy. So that's changed. So let's give them this time period here. So can you see the problem with this? Let me just ask you a question. Jesus is around 30 AD, okay, for the death, burial, resurrection. Most scholars will say it's around then. So what do we got? We got a time lag of about 40 years, right? So here comes my question to you. I'll start. But are you real clear about what you were doing 40 years ago?
Yes.
I mean, if
I write
really?
a memoir, and I am writing a book.
Oh.
40 years ago.
Oh, okay. So you're on top of it.
In the days before, so many people did not read and write. And the oral tradition was very, very strong. I mean, people could recite their lineage going back generations,
Right.
like the beginning of Matthew, where
Yeah.
they go back they take Jesus' lineage back to Abraham.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that people were amazing in their ability in those days.
Well, shoot, Jewish kids used to memorize big chunks of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
There are Muslim kids today that memorize the Quran. Not a
exactly.
part of it. They've memorized the whole Quran, which is about the New Testament length. Right? So you're right. I think people memorize a lot more. But, I mean, can you see right off, if people don't know all that stuff, and they go, wow, 40 years ago, I can't remember what I did 40 years ago. I'm trying to think back, so it'd be 1975. I was married, no kids, teaching at Orange Glen High School. That's about it. I couldn't tell you. No, 1975, April I did this, and May I.
The thing is, there's if you take the miracles of Jesus, and then they say, well, like there's like one or two of them that are in all four Gospels, and then there's a bunch of them that are in three of the Gospels, and then a bunch of them in two of the Gospels. But when you compare, they're similar. They're not identical, but they're very, very similar. So to me, that's a different person giving the same story.
Yeah.
Very likely that it actually happened.
In fact, cops say that if you talk to several people and they tell the exact same story, somebody sat down and made this thing up and they're all memorizing it, So
there you go.
Yeah.
But if it's slightly different.
Yeah, which you
probably
get.
true.
This is something we will talk about also. So, I mean, do you see the problem, though, that a person who doesn't really understand what you're saying as far as oral tradition, they look at that and they go, well, good grief. So the first time people sat there and said, let me tell you about Jesus. And it was 40 years later, and in some cases up to John, you're talking 65 years later. So all of a sudden some doubts start creeping in their minds, right? Oh, man, I don't know if I trust this stuff now. Well, here's the good news. There's a new area of research. And it's Paul, of all people. You say, really, Paul? So let's first just kind of get a background as far as Paul goes, and then I'll tell you what the connection is here. Born at Tarsus, I'll show you where it is on the map in just a second. It's a little confusing because sometimes he's called Saul early in his career, and then Paul. He was born of apparently a Roman citizen dad and a Jewish mom. So because he was born of a Roman dad, he was automatically a Roman citizen. So Paul is the Roman name. Saul is the Jewish name. Like there's an old King Saul in the Old Testament. Okay, so does that make sense? So two names, we know more by the word Paul. He was taught, he mentions this, he was taught by somebody named Gamaliel, who was the most powerful, clever, interesting rabbi of the time. So guess what? Paul was exceptional, right? You wouldn't let just anybody study under this guy. So he came from a great heritage, had the greatest learning possible. If he hadn't messed around with Christianity, he'd probably be, the Jews would still refer to him with great respect as a wonderful rabbi. He had his life made. Right? Christianity ruined his life. It didn't help his life. Right? It ruined it. So if you think, he did it for fame and fortune, don't think so. Persecuted some of the early Christians. There's a really powerful verse in the Bible. Maybe you've read it. It's in the book of Acts. They're stoning Stephen. He's the first martyr of the church. And who's there watching and collecting the robes as they stone him? It's Paul. Yeah. So can you imagine the rest of his life? I mean, if it was me and I changed my ways and became a follower of the same person that this martyr did, and at the time Paul was probably saying, yeah, go get him. don't you think the rest of his life he had that image of that blood-spattered guy getting hammered by those rocks and all? I mean, you know, you can change your heart, but your mind, you're still going to replay that scene. I bet that was there forever for the rest of his life. I bet he woke up in the middle of the night seeing Stephen more than once. Then he was converted. Very famous story. He was on the road to Damascus. What was he doing? Some of you know the story?
Going to a place to persecute Christians.
That's right. Roll those sleeves up, and
Yeah.
he's got probably a legal decree or something. He's going to go and throw him in jail, do whatever he has to do. Boy, he's gung-ho, right? Whatever he does 110%, doesn't he? Paul's a real charging kind of guy. He's not a sit-around sort of person. And it's that famous Damascus Road. They talk about having a Damascus Road experience. Just wacko, you know, instantly your life changes, and that's what happened to Paul.
It's so amazing that God would choose somebody like that and just turn him around.
Yeah. It's a wild story there, isn't it? And then he made, of course, 3 really important missionary trips. I'm going to come to that in just a second, but just to finish this slide off. And then most people think, based on history of the times, that he got caught up in this Nero persecution, which happened about 65, 66 A.D. You've heard that famous fire in Rome, the idea that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. I mean, that's not true, but apparently he did pull out a lyre or something and compose a song, you know, not to celebrate, but just to sing of the destruction of Rome. But anyway, he had to blame somebody. You know, a good politician, you got to point the finger. It can't be at you. So it's those dirty, rotten Christians. It must be them. So that's the first persecution. They're gathering up a lot of the Christians. Paul was probably part of that. Probably Peter. He may have died within a year or two of that, too. So around 65 A.D., Paul is gone. Well, his missionary trips. I wanted to spend just a second on that. First of all, you just have to put up with me because I'm a geography nut. But it's important, right? It's really good to know. So here's a picture, and I bet you can figure out a lot of this. You know, this, here we go. This is what country today?
Turkey.
Okay, that's Turkey. How about over here?
Greece.
Yeah, that's Greece. Of course, Italy, North Africa.
Malta.
Yeah, Malta's out over there. And then, of course, here's the Holy Land, and out here, Iran and Iraq and some of those other nations. So Paul comes along, gets converted, spends some time, he doesn't go out immediately and do a missionary trip. He spends some time kind of out in the boonies, right, out in the desert. And then he comes back and decides he needs to go spread this word. So his first trip, and you don't have to worry about those colored arrows. I wish they didn't have them on there, frankly. But his first trip is just up here and back, right? So just kind of think of it as a little circle right here. Can I point out something? There's Tarsus. That's where he was born. So it makes sense he would kind of go up that way as well. Jerusalem's down here. You should recognize a few names here. As he's talked to these people, look at that, Galatia. You heard of the book of Galatians? Okay, that was addressed to those people. Let me show you over Ephesus right there for the Ephesians, the book of Ephesians, and Colossae. You see that one right there? Book of Colossians. So a lot of the books, you know, he would set up the church first, and then he'd go off someplace else, and then he'd write back to them. He might say, keep going, you guys are doing a great job. Many times it was, what's wrong with you? You're going off the deep end. He was really upset at the people of Galatia, right? So that was the first, well, did it again. So there's the first trip, right? Just kind of stuck to this area here. A really important part of the book of Acts is when Paul gets what's called the vision of the man of Macedonia. He gets a vision, right? So I don't know if it was the middle of the night or when, but this man says, come over to Macedon, help us, teach us, tell us about Jesus. So where's Macedon? Up here. So you say, okay, so big deal. So he goes over there next. Well, here's why it's a big deal. Think, if you can kind of picture in your head sort of a line going diagonally here, everything on this side is considered Asia. It's called Asia Minor, but it's Asia. Everything on this side is the Western world, right? This is where the power was. This is where the influence is. This is where the money is. This is where things happen. This is where the roads are better. So if Paul goes here, he is now entering the big time, right? This would be like the minor leagues over here. This is the major leagues. So when he moves over there, now things happen faster, right? He's now stepping up to the big time. And he comes up... Okay, back it up here. So he comes up here, and there's Philippi, the book of Philippians. And then if you come down here a little bit, you see Thessalonica, Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. He comes down and does a real famous speech at Athens. If you have a chance, read that sometime, because he's dealing with all these philosophers and skeptics. And they say, let's hear what you have to say, Paul. And he tells them the story. And they were okay with what he had to say until he gets to the part about, and God came down to the earth as a human. They go, yeah. And they didn't really want to hear that. But they said, yeah, some other time. But he gave a pretty famous talk there. And then there's the town of Corinth, down kind of in the southern part. Tom?
Yeah, if you can ever physically get there. What?
Have you gone?
Yeah, all of them.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah.
What was that like? Did you have a good time?
Oh, it was awesome.
Wow.
It was.
So you're walking the probably same cobblestones
yeah,
that...
standing there where he stood there to give his famous speeches. And
Wow.
stuff, so.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of that's still original. And,
Right there.
oh, amazing. What else do we need to say? Well, eventually that little blue line means that Paul was brought to Rome to be on trial. But this is his first trial, apparently. So I'll show you here. It comes over here, has a shipwreck, and finally ends up here at Rome. Apparently he gets off, because that was like 61 or so, and he gets out and he goes and does some more stuff. Some people think he actually made it all the way over to Spain. Don't know. It's not in the New Testament. Yes?
Yeah. Isn't it true that Luke was with him? Because Luke wrote Acts and other
Yeah.
journeys. And he says we.
Yeah, the pronoun becomes we.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think he went all the time with them,
Yeah.
because sometimes it's just Paul and Silas or Paul and
Timothy.
Barnabas and Timothy, yeah. But you're right, several places it moves to we. And Paul calls him a dear beloved physician, so they had a good close relationship there. Any questions about the map?
No, only that Corinth was crossroads for economics.
I heard it was a real bustling place, kind of low lives there
Yeah.
too, right?
Yeah, but you just had all the people going and coming and
Yeah.
trading. So it would be somewhat like a big Hollywood.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So.
As seedy as that, huh? Well, yeah, look at the location there, because you're just along the shipping routes and all. So that was quite a jump, right, from this little local guy, and he ends up all the way over to Rome, the center of all power there with Nero and all the craziness that went on with that. So that's the background of Paul. Okay, let's talk about his letters real briefly. If you follow it from the column on the left and then go over the top column on the right, that's the order that you encounter them in the New Testament. And I put an asterisk by some of them because, again, you got critics that don't want to say that he wrote every single one of those letters. Okay, it's not going to matter for what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so let's give them that, right? If they want to criticize it, okay. The asterisks are the ones that everybody is in agreement on. Yes, we know he wrote Romans and the Corinthians and Galatians and Philippians. Not so sure about some of these others. I didn't put Hebrews up here because some people, that's kind of iffy, and it's basically not, indicated at all. The Bibles that you have and we have will say Paul's letter to the, fill in the blank. But some critics disagree about that. By the way, anybody ever read Philemon? That is a neat little piece of propaganda. Nobody reads that book. I think it's really cool. It's so short. It's like 30 verses or something. The last one? Paul is dealing with a runaway slave whose name is Onesimus, and the owner is Philemon. And Onesimus has become a Christian because of Paul. Now, Paul's in kind of a quandary. Philemon is a Christian as well. But it's a runaway slave, right? That's not a good thing in those days. So what does Paul do? So he writes a letter to Philemon saying, would you please take back Onesimus and not punish him? But he does it in a really clever, interesting way. It's a cool little letter. All right, so there's Paul's letters. So where are we going today? All right, well, we're not going to do all of Paul's letters. We're going to look at little nuggets that are buried inside Paul's letters, and their creeds and their hymns. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of time, especially today, on these creeds. But a creed is just a formalized statement of what you believe in. Right? I believe this. And usually it's in religious language because it's a religious creed, but creeds can be almost anything. Think about today, companies have creeds, they call them mission statements, but they're basically, what do we believe in as a company? And they take time to think about these things. So I just picked one as random. I thought it was pretty well done. It's from Bristol Myers, the drug company. They said, What's our mission? To discover, develop, and deliver innovative medicines that help patients prevail over serious diseases. Now remember, go back up there. A creed is supposed to be easy to remember. Is there anything about that Bristol-Myers creed that you would say, well, that's kind of clever. It looks like they put it together in a certain way that would help it. Yeah, you hear the alliteration going on there, the DDD, discovered. Yeah, I think people could feel that, or hear it. It will tickle their ears, the triple Ds.
Also patience prevail.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe the double P with patience prevail. And then even this one I think is interesting with the S's. There's a lot of S's there. I don't know if that was on purpose, but I mean, I got to believe at least the D's, right? Doesn't that make sense? Just that repetition, it catches your eye or your ear and you go, what? And it's a little more, I don't know, remarkable, right? Something that you could remember.
And what kind of medicine? Innovative.
Oh, innovative.
Which means it's discovered, not something that's been previous, right?
That's true. Yeah, an innovation is a new way of doing something. That's right. Innovative medicine. That's a good word choice. That's a nice word to use. Well, let's take it to the area of Christianity. Creeds abound. And somebody mentioned the Nicene Creed, right? This is one called the Apostles' Creed. I've tried to find the background on it, and it looks like they said parts of it may be from the 400s or 500s. Some parts got kind of added over the next few centuries, but this is a very ancient creed. It's 3 slides here, okay? I couldn't get it all on one, but again, think about what you're trying to do. You're trying to take everything about Christianity, everything that's in the New Testament, and get it down to just a nutshell. And that's not particularly easy to do. I think this is pretty good. It covers a lot of territory. And then I want to go back and let you think about why would they put it that way. So it says, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. He was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead. On the 3rd day he rose again. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church. By the way, the Catholic Church does not mean Roman Catholic. It just means universal.
Little c.
Yeah, little c. The communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. Amen. I won't go back through all the slides, but can you see in this one in particular, is there anything that's memorable about the way that's put together? I think, again, it wasn't just somebody hammering this thing out. I think they said, how can we help people remember this?
The rhythm.
Yeah, each of those little things is separate.
Yeah.
It's a list. And notice a lot of them say something of, something of, something of. That's like Abraham Lincoln, government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? That's not an accident. This is not an accident. I think that took some time. People thought about that. Isn't that amazing? Just 3 slides. I don't know how many lines. What do you think? 15, 16 lines? And you got the whole idea of Christianity. Wow. You got to deal with God. You got to deal with Jesus. You got to deal with the Holy Spirit. You got to deal with his life, his death, the purpose of his existence. Boom. It's all up there in 3 slides. So that's pretty impressive. So that's the Apostles' Creed, right? So we're still talking creeds here. So let's look at some of the New Testament creeds. I didn't have time and space up here to put them all, but let me share with you a couple of them. They're all over, by the way, in these letters. So I'm hopping all over the place. So 1 Corinthians 11. This is a very famous scene if you ever are involved with doing the Lord's Supper at a church. Somebody will read part of this, right? So 1 Corinthians 11:23 says, For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and said, This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. Okay, so this apparently was something that was passed down because he says, I received it from the Lord and I'm passing along to you. So this is something the whole church chanted together or said together or whatever. They memorized this, right? So Paul puts it in this letter to the Corinthians. How about Philippians? This is a hymn. I wanted to switch it up here, so I've got a hymn for you to see here. Here we go. I just put a piece of it, but it's a beautiful hymn, and I don't know if you can see it from there, but can you see that it looks different? It looks like a poem, right? Right up in there, it looks like a poem. Because it was a song. And I always thought in my own weird science fiction way, I wish I had a time machine. It'd be kind of interesting to go back and go to an early church and hear this, because they wouldn't have just said this. It was a song. So they must have sung it. I always wondered what would it have sounded like? Kind of a Middle Eastern thing? I mean, I don't know. What did any music sound like from the first century? I don't think anybody knows. And then you got the Psalms of David. Anybody know what those sounded like? No. There's some directions in there about, Selah or something. What does that mean? I don't know. We've lost all of that. But anyway, here's the hymn. He says, your attitude, this is the part that's not the song. It says, your attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ. Here comes the song. Who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that's above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Okay, so there's a song right in the middle of this. I'll go faster on some of these others, but Colossians has some. He's the image of the invisible God, for by him all things were created. That's quite a claim. Right? He's the image. If you want to see what God looks like, look at Jesus. Move to Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy. Now, I know I said before, some people don't believe these are Paul's letters or somebody else's. It doesn't matter. They're still creeds, and they're still buried inside whoever wrote these letters, right? So I'll show you why we know it's not their own wording in a little bit later here. 1 Timothy 3:16, he appeared in a body, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by angels, was preached among the nations. That one seems like it would be pretty easy to remember. Can you hear the rhythm kind of built into that one? He appeared, vindicated, was seen, was preached. I mean, it just kind of rolls along. And then you got 2 Timothy. Remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David. Now, that's pretty short, but it's still considered a creed. Okay, so summary. We've been talking about what they are. They're really, really early. I'll show you why in another slide or two. They're supposed to be easy to remember. They got some kind of rhythm, or maybe a alliteration or something going on. And it was a good way so that a believer who wanted to take a new believer and give them the basics real fast could do it through these creeds, right? Instead of saying, "Oh, you want to know what Jesus is all about? Just here, read this." Who's got the time? Who's got this all written in front of them anyway? So you say, "Look, here it is in form, right? Just a short form," and then you could sing it, and the person coming in after a few times would catch on, right? They'd be able to remember that. Or it's a creed, and you could learn that. So again, I wanted to ask you something here. For good or for bad, do you ever get songs kind of stuck in your head? Any songs you nominate? I mean, what songs do you say? Maybe it's hymns. I don't know, but which ones are favorites right now? I won't ask you to, but you could actually sing it because you know the words. You've heard it so many times.
My grandmother told me that Tarara Bundie led some people to go absolutely mad. And they became insane.
That's funny. Some people went mad. Huh?
Oh, the old rugged cross.
Yeah, that's been around a long time. Yeah.
How great thou art.
How great thou art.
Amazing Grace.
Oh, yeah, Amazing Grace. I read a piece one time. I thought it was really interesting. Somebody said that's probably the most sung and most beloved of all hymns. And the question is, why? And they said, well, for one thing, it's very easy to sing it. Secondly, it's got a lot of single syllables. Right? And thirdly, it doesn't irritate people by bringing up anything that's denominational, like how do you get baptized? What kind of church should you go to? Even who's Jesus? I mean, if it kind of leaves all that, you figure that out. But and I think it appeals to just everybody because it talks about down deep, I know I'm not what I ought to be, save a wretch like me. So that's, but Amazing Grace, a lot of people know that one. Most people know the Star Spangled Banner. I think it's funny. I've heard little kids say they wondered who Jose was, like some Hispanic that's being honored in the song.
A little Christian said, "Who was Harold?"
Harold be thy name, yeah. Yeah, but we know these things, don't we? Because we've heard them enough, and there's enough of a rhythm or a rhyme, or it sounds cool, right? We memorize those things. So it seems logical to me that you would have things like that early Christians would have found appropriate. So we're still getting there. It's taking me a while. I want to get to one creed in particular, but I want to give you a timeline here for Paul. So here's a timeline, right? We've already covered the Gospels, right? 70, I'm letting them have those high dates. I think they're closer, but let's say it's 70 to 95, something along there. Jesus is 30 when he's put to death. Most scholars, again, are in agreement on these dates, right? So it's not me coming up with strange stuff. These scholars are saying, we think Paul was converted about 32. Okay, so within 2 years of the death of Jesus, Paul's on that road to Damascus, whammo. 35 AD, and I'll show you why we get this date, he goes to Jerusalem. He wants to know the basics of the story, right? So he goes to Jerusalem. I'll tell you in a second who he meets and talks to there. He mentions later on that he took a second trip to Jerusalem. This is years later, right? 49 AD. How do we know that? I'll get to that in just a second. 51 AD. He's in Corinth preaching, right? That's his stop on that little missionary loop that I was showing you. So 51 AD. How do we know that? Well, if you want to sometime, take a look in Acts 18. It says, while Gallio was proconsul in Achaia, the region of Corinth. And you say, well, so what? Well, what's interesting is Gallio was only there. They know it from other sources. He's only there for like a year or two. And it says that's when Paul was there. So they go, oh, bingo, right? You put those two together. Gallio, Paul, 51 AD. So there are extra sources that kind of reinforce what's going on in the Bible, so you can actually peg some dates on things there. So 51 AD, he's there, he's preaching. He leaves, and he starts hearing things about the Corinthians. And if that's okay, I wanted to share with you, because I just think of how, I guess it's not funny, because I'm sure it bothered Paul, but he has to say things like this. I appeal to you, this is chapter 1, I appeal to you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ that all of you agree with one another, so there may be no divisions among you, that you may be perfectly united. My brothers, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is this. One of you says, I follow Paul. Another says, I follow Apollos. Another one says, I follow Cephas. Another one says, I follow Christ. And he's really upset at him, right? You guys are splitting up. You're starting to argue among yourselves. Chapter 3 starts off, brothers, I could not address you as spiritual, but as worldly, mere infants. I gave you milk, not solid food. You weren't ready for it. And then he says in verse 3, you're still worldly. There's jealousy and quarreling among you. Aren't you worldly? You're acting like men. So can you see this? It's just like, oh my goodness, come on. So he's hearing all these reports back. He set the church up, walked away, and they started sniping at each other. He's going, ah. So in 55, again, as the best guess, he writes the book of letter to the Corinthians because they're squabbling. And then the rest of the timeline here. Okay, so any questions about the timeline as far as, I wish I could have done it left to right so you could see it on a line, so I had to put it up there that way. But does that make sense as far as just the timeline? Okay, how do we know some of these things? Well, let me show you. It's the book of Galatians. That's one of those books. Remember that the critics are going to give everybody. They're going to say, yeah, we think Paul wrote Galatians. Okay, so let's see what happens in Galatians. Paul gives us all sorts of clues as far as letting us hook it onto a time sequence. Okay, this is Galatians chapter 1. Again, you don't need to write any of this down. I'll send you notes. Verse 11, he says, I want you to know that the gospel I preach is not something that man made up. I didn't receive it from any man. And then I'm going to skip ahead here. He says, I tried to persecute the church of God, tried to destroy it. And he says, but when God was pleased to reveal his Son to me, I did not consult any man, nor did I go up to Jerusalem. So he's saying in 32 AD, whammo, I got converted. I didn't go to Jerusalem then. That's what he says. Okay. I went immediately into Arabia and later returned to Damascus. So what did he do? He went out in the boonies, as I said before, just to kind of get his head together and kind of think about what this all meant. And supposedly Jesus taught him out there as he's sitting out in the desert. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with, and I think this is important, he mentions 2 key names here, Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. Okay, so get the timeline here. 2 years go by after Jesus' death. Paul's converted. He says, I didn't go to Jerusalem right then. I wanted to collect my thoughts before I heard anybody else. And he says, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem. And he hung out with Peter for 2 weeks and a day, 15 days, he says. Now, if you're going to hang out with somebody, would Peter be a good guy to hang out with if you want to know something about Christianity? Yeah. I mean, Peter was right there, right? He was the one that Jesus was close to along with John, right? So they were the two closest. So he hangs out with them for 15 days. Do you think they just talked about fishing? I don't think so. I think they talked about the whole message. What should I say? What am I going to get across to these people? And then how about James? Would that be useful to hang out with James?
Because he knew Jesus when he was a little kid.
Yeah. Don't you imagine Paul said, what was it like growing up with somebody that did everything right? Can't you be more like your brother Jesus? Oh man, having to live up to that, huh? But so he hung out with James. Now James is kind of interesting too because of the two. Peter, always believed and hung out with Jesus. James didn't. James was part of the family. In fact, it says in the Bible there that the family came one time to take Jesus away because they thought he was nuts. And James is apparently converted after the death of Jesus, and he becomes the head of the church. So he was a real go-getter too. He's the book of James is named after him. So he's dealing with one guy who was with Jesus the whole way, and he's dealing with another guy that changed his way, saw Jesus his whole life, now thinks he's the Messiah. And so he sits there with those two. He's got him for 2 weeks. Right? So that's the first one there, Galatians 1. So that's the 35 AD trip that he takes. But he goes on in Galatians 2. Let me share that one with you. 14 years later, that's how it starts. 14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. So now he's got a buddy, right, Barnabas. So they go to Jerusalem. Who do they talk to this time? Well, let me skip ahead here. James, Peter, and John gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles, and they go to the Jews. It says, these men added nothing to my message. So here's the deal. I'm skipping some of this just because of time, but he's been preaching, right, from 35 to 49. That's 14 years. And I don't know why, but all of a sudden he's got some doubts. Am I really preaching the right message? Am I saying the right thing? Am I saying it the best way I could? So he says, I need a refresher. So he goes back to Jerusalem. This time he's added one more person, John. Would that be useful? Yeah, John was close to Jesus, right? He's probably the one that Jesus on the cross turns his mother over to. He says, yeah. And so you wouldn't trust your mom to anybody, right? So he turns him over to John. So he's got John, he's got James again, he's got Peter again. So he says, I went one more time, right? 14 years later, so now we're up to 49 AD. And then he mentions this creed, and that's what we're going to focus on for the last 15 minutes or so here. It's in 1 Corinthians 15. So now we're up to 55 AD, right? That's when he's writing the letter to the Corinthians. So here it is. Again, you can look it up on your own, but let's just read it here. It says, for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas. That's a name for Peter, same name. And then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep, meaning died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and he says he later appeared to me as well. So, again, this is not me making this stuff up. Scholar after scholar agrees this is a creed. This is another little nugget that's stuck in 1 Corinthians.
Not only that, going back just a moment.
Yeah.
When he says according to the Scriptures, he's really talking about some Old Testament Scriptures, right? And the prophecy.
Yeah.
Christ died.
Yeah. It's
So he's validating
that's
where
right.
he's coming from.
Yeah. If you remember the story of Jesus in Luke, after he's back from the dead and he's walking along the road to Emmaus, and there's some people there that said, did you hear what happened to Jesus? They're all down. And then it says he told them from the Scriptures that it all had to happen. So you're right. What's he doing? He's using the Old Testament. So Matthew's especially big on that. Matthew will take you back a lot to the Old Testament to say, as it was fulfilled, he'll bring in Isaiah, or he'll bring in somebody else. So, yeah, you're right. Okay, why is it a creed? Well, it starts off, what I received, right? You see that there, first line, for what I received. That is lingo, that is language scholars have found that means this is a tradition that got passed on from person to person. So they call that what I received. In other words, Paul's heard this, he's received it. Somebody has said, this is for you, right? It's like a gift or something, but it's tradition. It's not new. It's not Paul sitting there saying, I need a catchy phrase here. He says, I received it, right? It was somebody gave it to me, and it says, I passed it on. So again, this is the idea of not I made it up, not that I'm creating this. Somebody gave it to me, I'm passing it along to somebody else, right? That's a creed by definition. Somebody way back when came up with it, they gave it to me, I'm passing it along. So here's the setup at the bottom of the page. I was able to get that one in kind of a linear form. So you had the actual events, the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. The early followers who saw that or reported it real early, and I'll give you an estimate here in a minute, real early said, let's turn that event into a creed so that we can remember it and pass it along. So then they gave that to Paul. Remember, he's in Jerusalem. That's where he gets the creed. And what does he do? He passes it along. He says, I received it, I'm passing it along. So he received it from the earlier followers, then he passed it along to the Corinthians. So that's just a time sequence. Does that make sense? Going that way? Okay, so what is interesting about this that I didn't come across until just a few weeks ago? I thought it was pretty cool. Maybe it's because I'm a literature person, but remember we talked parallelism, I think, last time we were talking about Old Testament poetry. If you don't remember that, or we didn't talk about it enough, I want to introduce the idea of parallelism, and then we're going to see it in that creed. These are all examples of parallelism. Eat, drink, and be merry. You win a few, you lose a few. She has a tiny dog, a huge diamond, a new car, and an old husband. To know him is to hate him. She rode up the hill, pumping her legs, breathing heavily, and grinning from ear to ear. What do you notice in each one of these that makes this thing parallel? What do you think parallelism is? Every one of those, you could say, is an example of parallelism. How would you define it then?
If you take to know him as to hate him, you got a tutu.
Right. To know, to hate, right? Can you hear a repetition? Any of the others have repetition?
Their verbs are repeated.
3 verbs. Do these 3 things.
Clauses.
This one is just to flip around, right? You win, you lose. Adjective, noun, adjective, noun, adjective, noun, adjective, noun, right? There's a pattern. You could have a bunch of them if you want, or you could just have a couple. And then the last one, what seems to hold this whole thing together? Do you hear repetition there? Yeah, the INGs, right? Pumping, breathing, and grinning. That's the only thing that makes that memorable, because you're going, wait a minute, I'm hearing something, right? There's a repetition going on. So it's a fancy term. It's just parallelism means you take some piece of English, in our case English, and you just repeat it several times if you can, and it's memorable, right? Your ear is tickled by that. It's that's why we have so many of these expressions like you win a few, you lose a few, right? It's just part of our language. So let's go back to that creed, but I'm going to set up the creed a little bit different. You probably didn't pick up on it before. There's parallelism in this creed. You're looking and go, well, where's the parallelism? So let's do this. Focus on just the first 3 items. Just go down to here. Don't worry about 4, 5, 6. Did you notice 1 and 3 seem to have something parallel to each other? Yeah, do you see the last half here? According to the Scriptures. There it is again. According to the Scriptures. Second one is not. Okay, so the pattern looks like it's a 1 and 3, and number 2 is not. So it's 1, skip 1, there's another one, right? So 1, skip, parallelism. How about 4, 5, 6? It does the same kind of thing. Can you see where it's parallel here? He appeared and then. He was seen then. I mean, do you hear it? It doesn't use the and, I guess, but do you see the something and then, the something and then? That's parallel. The 5th one is not. So what have you got here? You've got parallelism 1, 3, and 4, 6. It's not an accident. There's parallelism all over the Bible. Sometime go back and read the Tower of Babel in Genesis. That's a parallel piece the way it's done. So parallelism is a cool thing for the Jews, I guess, right? They were real big on that, and it's even in the New Testament as well.
And
So,
Psalms actually make a statement.
they have tons, yeah.
Words,
yeah, exactly. Or they'll do opposite statement. The wise man does such and such, but the fool does, you know. And Proverbs is full of parallelism too. Yeah, you're right. In fact, for the Jews, they didn't rhyme anything. There was no rhyming in their poetry. It wasn't like roses are red, violets are blue, da da da, and I love you, right? So they didn't do that. It was parallelism. That was their idea. But you see, they're doing that parallelism so that you can remember this creed about Jesus. So now, the one thing we haven't talked about is, well, how early is this creed? This knocked my socks off when I first heard about this. I hadn't come across this till just a few years ago. This creed thing is getting really hot and heavy for scholars. They're really researching this stuff. The best guess by scholars who are even critics of Christianity is that the creeds, especially this one in 1 Corinthians, which is probably the primo one that people look at more than any others, is before his conversion. 32, maybe 31, possibly even 30 AD, the same year Jesus died. There are some scholars who think this creed got created in the fall of the same year that Jesus was crucified. Why would people think it's that old? So here's just some background. Why are they thinking it's that old? Well, he was in Jerusalem twice. He certainly was there to probably receive the creed. But beyond that, the things that are in the creed itself, when it says the 12, when it says he appeared, the way it says for our sins, we don't get it in English, but the people who have studied this say it sounds very, very early Jewish stuff. It doesn't sound like Paul. It's not his vocabulary. It's not the way he said things. Okay, so it's not created by Paul. Remember, he received it and he passed it along. It's got that Hebrew poetic style. So these are real early Christians. They're just immersed in Judaism, right? I mean, they're Jews. So when they create the creed, it's very Jewish. They use the word Cephas. Now, your Bible will translate it and say Peter. But why are they using Cephas? Because that's the language that the early church had in that local area, right? The Aramaic language. Do you notice, by the way, when you read the stories of Jesus, there are a couple places where you actually get to hear the Aramaic? He's on the cross and he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. You ever heard that one? And they have to translate it for you. It's my God, why have you forsaken me? But that's Aramaic. You're actually hearing that old language.
He says to the little girl.
Little girl. Yeah. Yeah. So there's the other place where you hear some Aramaic. So it would be kind of the common language of an area. You know, that's all it is. It was common in the Middle East, kind of a, you know, if you didn't know your Greek very well and you didn't know Hebrew, you could get by in Aramaic. So that's pretty old. It was an early way to talk about Peter, to call him Cephas. And then this quote at the end, I'll share who said it in just a second, but this person says, all the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Now that sounds pretty good. You know who came up with that? The guy who is one of the other leaders of the Jesus Seminar. So even he thinks this creed goes way, way, way back. I thought that was neat. This is not just some later Christian who's, you know, enthused about it. This is a person who doesn't necessarily buy into everything about Jesus, but he buys into this creed. He says it's probably within 2 years of the time of Jesus. So let's look at the timeline once again. I'm just going to put that creed in there. So you still have the Gospels. You still have Paul dealing with Corinth. You have the trips that he took to Jerusalem. And now you can stick that creed in there somewhere 30 or 31 AD. And then the death of Jesus. So I wanted to get to why in the world do we care about this? What does that do? But by looking at the timeline, do you have any thoughts about this? Why do we care about this creed? Is it just kind of historical curiosity? Oh, that's nice. Paul was doing some stuff.
Because it's right after Jesus' death. And people say, oh, well, it was so long afterwards, they just made it up, they just remembered and made it up. But here we have it right after Jesus died. Or maybe even before.
Yeah. If you depend only on the Gospels, and you're talking to people who are skeptics or something, and they say, well, good heavens, you got 40 years that go by. Who knew what you did 40 years ago? And I'd say, yeah, I don't know. I can't remember what I did 40 years ago. But do you think within a year or two, would the memory be a little sharper? Yeah, I would think so. So this thing has just been real revelation to a lot of people. It's actually a better way, isn't it, to know what the early Christians taught about Jesus. If you want to know what they taught, can't we find out as close as possible to the event? Wouldn't that be more useful? Like, let's take World War II. You could read about it in a textbook, but would it be more useful to talk to a soldier who was there? Right, we're losing them every day, but there's still a lot of soldiers left from World War II. I mean, they were there. Better to hear from them. What was it like to sit there in those fields and get shot at and things like that? Secondly, there's an eyewitness quality to that creed, isn't there? Because it says 500 are still alive. So what's Paul kind of hinting at there? If he says, well, remember that he didn't invent this, but it says 500 are still alive. Well, what's that creed hinting at? What could you do about it if you wanted to follow up and you still were kind of cynical about the whole story?
Check the rooms.
Yeah, go talk. 500 of them. It's not just one lone crazy person out there. I have 500 of them. This is a challenge to the skeptics, right? To say, you don't buy it? Hey, I'll give you a list. Go check with these people. Third, it was supported by key early Christians. This is Peter, this is James, this is John, this is Paul, right? These are the early Christians. They're all buying into this thing. It's the same message as the gospel. It's the same message. And this, I think, is kind of cool at the end here. It refutes other theories, right? People have come up with all sorts of theories about what happened to Jesus. So let me run through them. And remember, the creed is going to take you back really to that time period. So let's try a few of the theories. So here we are in the year 2000 plus. People have said, I don't want to buy this resurrection thing. I think there's something that happened to Jesus on the cross. I think there really was a Jesus. And yeah, he was probably put up on a cross. But I think he swooned. He actually fainted, and the Romans thought he was dead, pulled him off, handed him over. They took him into a tomb. It was cool in there. He didn't have enough blood loss. And he came to, got out, went back to the disciples, and they said, the Son of God, he's arisen. He is divine. That's a crazy theory, first of all, but okay. How does this creed throw that out the window? What did they say happened to Jesus? It says he died on the cross. He was buried. I mean, it doesn't say anything else, right? So who are you going to believe? Somebody that 2,000 years later is dreaming up a theory, or the people who were there that said, this is why we're going to put our lives on the line, right? Because we think this really happened. Okay, so this... By the way, do you see any other holes in that swoon theory? It seems like a really odd theory. Most scholars today have given up on that one. Anything else kind of nuts about that?
Yeah, the skull with blood loss.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the beatings.
Ah.
And also, one of the soldiers sticks him with his pike, and what comes out is blood mixed with separated. Yeah.
Yeah, serum.
Yeah.
Right. Well, plus, I mean, the Romans...
Wouldn't happen unless it were done. Yeah.
Sure, yeah, I mean, the Romans, really? They don't know when a guy is dead?
They do this all the
They
time.
did it all.
It's their job.
That was their job, right? And they were pretty efficient. You know, if your job is to put somebody to death, you put them to death, right? Or you're in trouble. Plus, can you imagine the guy's in the tomb, he gets out. How's he get out? I don't know. How's he get past the guards? I don't know. Then he goes back to his disciples, staggers in there, blood, all over the place, and they go, it's a miracle. No, they'd say, boy, you're one lucky dude, just hide off someplace, we'll try to get you fixed up. But you're not going to worship this guy. You're going to go out and die for this guy? You're going to say, you're lucky. You're not the Son of God, good for you. You're not going to risk your fortune and fame and your life and all that kind of stuff for that. Here's another theory that went around. The disciples stole a body. How does the creed kind of throw a monkey wrench into that?
In Acts, you see them huddling together in the upper room, and they're scared to death, and they are helpless, and they are just wimps. And
Yeah.
then all of a sudden, Jesus appears to them, and they're, whoa! And they go out and change the world.
Yeah. Do you do that if you got a body hidden downstairs somewhere and you say, oh no, he's the Son of God? Well, again, think about what it said in the creed. Did it say anything about this? No, it says he died. He was really dead. He was gone. The creed contradicts that completely. Women went to the wrong tomb. That's another theory. The women went there and they go, hey, nobody's in there. He must have come back from the dead. And they ran back and they told the disciples, and they went, woohoo! Now he's back from the dead.
Well, the cloth was lying there. I didn't know.
Yeah?
So it couldn't have been a long tomb.
Yeah, but the first question was, who stole his body from the women?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden they have a complete change of attitude.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Mary sees him.
Sure.
Because they have guards, Roman guards,
Yeah.
by the tomb too. Nobody would interfere with them.
Well, again, what does it say in the creed that he appeared to a whole bunch of people? If they went to the wrong tomb, he's really lying in another tomb dead. He's not going to show up, right? So the creed keeps knocking holes in these kinds of things. Plus, if the women went to the wrong tomb, where did they start preaching that Jesus rose from the dead? In the same city, right? It's in Jerusalem. All they have to do, the people that don't like this, is say, "Are you kidding me? He's over here." Open that tomb up, drag him out, and say, "There's your Messiah." And they don't do that, though. They preach it right there in that city, which seems pretty amazing to me. How about the hallucination theory, right? It says 500 people saw him, and most of them are still alive. That's in the creed. Could 500 people hallucinate the same thing? That's not how hallucinations work, right? They're individual. Who hallucinates the exact same thing? Right? It could be mass hysteria, I guess, but you wouldn't report the same thing. But Paul says you can go see those people. They saw him. How about this one? I love this one. The disciples missed him so much that they sat around and they just kind of generated this thing that he's back. It was just wishful thinking. Does that work?
No, they weren't sitting around. They were fearing for their lives.
Yeah.
We're going to have to scatter.
Well, plus, who's the guy out here that's been carrying this creed around and doing all this stuff? It's Paul. Was he missing Jesus? No, right? Wasn't he the one that was persecuting and saying this whole thing's wrecking our Jewish faith? I got to snuff it out. He wasn't. Oh gosh, I hope Jesus is ready to come back. No way. And James wasn't that way either, right? James is going, bah humbug, my crazy brother. So that doesn't work either. So you got all these theories that just kind of fall apart. A lot of them the creed pokes holes in, but just doing some thinking. This is a very difficult thing for people who are skeptics to deal with. What happened that day when he was thrown into that tomb and all? And the creed deals with that, I think, pretty well. Let me close at this one, then I'll stick around if you have some questions. But Gary Habermas, if you want, you can go to his website, garyhabermas.com, all one word. He's the leading leading expert in the whole thing about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. If you want to read a whole bunch of stuff, some of it's pretty technical because he's a professor. By the way, he does some interesting work on the Shroud of Turin. You ever heard of the Shroud?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, this big burial sheet that's, I forgot, a couple of feet wide and about 15 feet long or something like that, that has this image of a dead person on it. And some people think it could be the burial shroud of Jesus. This is weird stuff. So I won't take the time now. Later, maybe. But here's what Habermas had to say about this creed. He says, "No longer can it be charged that there is no demonstrable early witness testimony for the resurrection or for the other most important tenets of Christianity. For this creed," right, that's the one we just spent time on, 1 Corinthians, "this creed provides just such evidential data concerning the facts of the gospel, which are the very center of the Christian faith." I think that's a real good point there, isn't it? I mean, if Jesus was just a nice guy saying nice things, I don't think that religion would have lasted. But Christianity makes some really specific claims. There was this guy Jesus, yes, and he said some pretty amazing things, yes, but the death, burial, and the resurrection, that's the heart of the whole message. And he says this creed takes you so far back, way beyond the Gospels, right, closer to the event. He says it's providing eyewitness testimony, right? These had to be people who were there. Now, could they be mistaken? Yeah. It's not a slam dunk, so I mean, they could be mistaken, but it seems odd. So he's saying this creed is the way to go if you want to look at something way back. And notice it's the same message as the Gospels. So if they got it right, or at least they interpreted it right, now you got it all the way back, same message, into maybe the fall or the next year. That's a whole lot better. I'm not saying the Gospels are off or bad, but this is a different way to argue that same event. Well, thank you very much for coming. I will stick around if you have any questions or comments or whatever. Hope you all have a good Christmas.
How come Mark leaves the resurrection out?
Yeah, Mark's Gospel. Your Bibles will have a little note. What?
And the birth.
Well, only Luke has the birth.
Yeah. Mark's Gospel at the end there, it'll say the following verses are not in the best manuscripts. And that's the part. It just, yeah, it leaves it, let's see. It is an odd place to leave it, and I've heard several different possibilities. So here's what it says at the end. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. That may be the end of Mark. In other words, they went to the tomb, and the angel shows up and says, don't be alarmed. He is risen. He's not here. Go tell his disciples. He's going ahead of you into Galilee, and then you'll see him there. The women left, and they're all bothered by this thing. So, there are all sorts of theories. One is that there was a longer ending and it wore off, because when you wrap a scroll up, the outside's the one that's going to get ripped up first. So it may have been the ending on that. Some people say, yeah, but his is a quick gospel, right? It's just, his is so short. And it was written first, and there are people later who actually criticize Mark's gospel and say, well, others wanted to clarify it. So Matthew got written, and Luke got written, and John got written. So it maybe just he was in a big fat hurry. Maybe some people say the scroll was just a certain size for him, and he filled it up, done. So I don't know. But you're right. So it says, mine says right here, the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16, 9 through 20. Yeah. But thank goodness we got 3 other Gospels anyway to tell, the same message there.
Yeah.